The CIA planned some horrible things during the Cuban crisis. A large amount of false flag attacks were planned, and only JFK saying no stopped it. It's called Operation Northwoods.
Read the details of Operation Northwoods and ask yourself, was 9/11 an inside job Bush agreed to, the type of operation JFK said no? The Patriots Act laws enacted after 9/11 limiting our freedoms. We're sitting on a shelf for a long time waiting for. Here's a detailed rundown of every major action proposed under Operation Northwoods, all of which President Kennedy rejected. Staging or committing acts of terrorism and violence against American military and civilian targets, then blaming Cuba. This included proposals to bomb civilian targets in U.S. cities, like Miami and Washington, assassinate Cuban émigrés in the U.S., and orchestrate a fake, communist Cuban terror campaign, to make it look like Castro's government was attacking Americans. Sinking boats of Cuban refugees. The plan suggested sinking boats carrying Cuban refugees, either actually or by simulating it, and blaming the Cuban government to generate outrage and support for military intervention. Hijacking planes and staging attacks on aircraft. Proposals included hijacking or simulating the hijacking of civilian airliners, faking a Cuban Air Force attack on a civilian jet, possibly using a drone aircraft, and even repainting planes to resemble U.S. Air Force jets for staged incidents. Blowing up a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay. The plan called for blowing up a U.S. Navy ship in Cuban waters and blaming the attack on Cuban sabotage, with the explicit goal of creating casualty lists in U.S. newspapers to spark public indignation and support for war. Simulating or provoking attacks on the U.S. base at Guantanamo. This included staging incidents like sabotaging facilities, starting fires, shelling the base, or even bribing someone in Castro's government to attack the base, all to create the appearance of Cuban aggression. Faking attacks on allied nations. Northwoods even suggested covertly attacking other countries like Jamaica or Trinidad and Tobago, both British Commonwealth members, and blaming Cuba, hoping to pull the UK into supporting action against Castro. Provoking Cuban responses through harassment and deception. The plan recommended a series of coordinated incidents and deceptive actions to convince Cuba an invasion was imminent, hoping to provoke a real Cuban response that could be used as justification for U.S. military action. All these proposals were signed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and submitted to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in March 1962, but President Kennedy flatly rejected them, and none of these false flag operations were ever carried out.
Now think about that. That's a lot of false flag attacks, even on other countries, to pull them into a war, including drones, back in 1962. Would George Bush have the same moral character to tell the CIA no after his father was the head of the CIA? Question mark. Now here's all the circumstantial, coincidental, possible reasons 9/11 was an inside job.
If you're looking for all the circumstantial or coincidental factors that fuel suspicion about Bush and 9/11, here's a rundown of what's often cited. There were a series of intelligence warnings in the months before 9/11, some even titled, "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S., but they were general, not specific, and didn't point to the exact method or date. Some officials, like Attorney General John Ashcroft, stopped flying commercial airlines due to warnings about a possible attack, which raised eyebrows in hindsight. The Project for a New American Century (PNAC), a think tank with several Bush administration members, wrote in 2000 that their plans for U.S. military dominance would be hard to achieve, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor, which conspiracy theorists see as eerily prescient. On the day of 9/11, there were multiple military and intelligence war games happening, which some argue may have caused confusion and delayed response. There were unusual stock trades, put options, placed on United and American Airlines right before the attacks, suggesting possible foreknowledge by someone, though the identities of those traders were never made public and no direct link to the Bush administration was found. President Bush's own account of seeing the first plane hit the World Trade Center on TV is odd, since that footage wasn't broadcast live, leading some to question his recollection. Immediately after 9/11, Bush and others in his administration pushed hard to link the attacks to Iraq, even though intelligence and allies like the Saudis said there was no connection. The bin Laden family and other Saudis were allowed to leave the U.S. soon after the attacks, with government approval, which many find suspicious given the circumstances. None of these points are concrete proof of foreknowledge or complicity. They're the kinds of coincidences and unanswered questions that drive speculation and conspiracy theories, but official investigations and independent reviews haven't found evidence that Bush or his team knew about the attacks in advance or let them happen on purpose. Read the details of Operation Northwoods and ask yourself.
But we do know the laws enacted in the Patriot Act were sitting on a shelf for quite a while, waiting for question mark. I think 9/11 was an inside job. I think George Bush doesn't have the moral character JFK did, and having a father who was the head of the CIA, George Bush would allow the CIA to go ahead